Hello, everyone. So today we're getting into some day-to-day life in the Enlightenment. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of kind of mishmash of things here, and we'll try to make sense of it at the end, but that's okay. All right. So one of the interesting things that we are seeing here is the kind of concept of communities, okay, and the villages and town, and it's becoming like an important type of thing. And so festivals and religious holidays are like super important. So we have lots of gatherings for like the harvest or religious festivals. Christmas and Easter are becoming bigger, and the idea is that you're having again these festivals to get people to unite together and maybe see a miniature horse for those of you that understand what the visual here is, but that's okay. And so probably the biggest one that exemplified that is Carnival. Okay, Carnival is in Spain, Italy, France, Germany, Austria. We also see it in some of the colonies as well. The activities are things like eating, drinking, and celebrating to excess. And what it really did, and Carnival could go on for like a week or more. It provides a break to the unceasing work during the rest of the year because remember, most people are laboring in some type of way. And so this just gives you that opportunity to have a break and a breather to have fun. And it was often in the weeks preceding up to Lent, because again, Lent is the focus on giving things up and sacrificing and getting in touch with God. And not that you can't still have fun and be in touch with God. But the idea here is that we want to have this kind of last chance to indulge in some things that you might not normally do. Lots of music and dancing, and sometimes very suggestive with that. And even in some areas, which was interesting, you were actually able to criticize the government or other superior people without penalty, and sometimes even acts of violence like pelting someone with like food like apple or eggs or flour was allowed as well. We're not like full-blown purge here, people, but the idea was to let people loose, to kind of have some fun in the break and how tough things were. And we see some pictures from even Carnival today, the masks, the instrument parades, and all sorts of stuff. You see all the people, and I mean, it's generally about a lot of fun. And what also became important to this was the tavern. The tavern is the chief gathering place for the commoners. Mostly it's for like men to talk and play games and drink things like gin and vodka because the whole idea was it was cheap. And actually, it was often a place for people to do some small business type things. And if you look at the picture here, you can see like you got these guys playing cards, they're hanging out. You got this guy passed out, maybe a little bit too much drinks. It was really, again, a place for the community because that's what it's all about. And it's also kind of representative of the widening gap between the wealthy and the commoners. They do many of the same things, but there's still a separation of the quality and areas where those things are being done. Women, for the most part, aren't allowed to go to these places. Sorry, ladies. It was considered kind of unseemly for you to be there. But nonetheless, this was important, again, for people to have opportunities to kind of get together and be involved. Now, we also have some things and changes with crime and punishment. Not that necessarily crime changes, but particularly in the cities, things were kind of bad. You are looking at increasing numbers of crime. Part of that's going to be due to just sheer numbers of people, but we're also going to talk about that's also going to have a big issue to do with as well poverty. And just like you see today, areas of high poverty, you're often going to see areas of increased crime. And that's something we need to understand and we'll move forward. In the past, dealing with crime was pretty rush. Judicial torture to obtain information and confessions was still the norm. You have things like the rack or thumb screws, which you see there, which will slowly break your thumbs. It's terrible. Public execution was still really common coming into this thing. For instance, I mean, you could actually also get the death penalty for property damage and stuff. By 1800, in various areas across Europe, there were over 200 crimes that could get you the death penalty. Nobles were often given quick deaths, so they were not, they wouldn't necessarily escape these things, but commoners were typically tortured brutally before being killed. And hard and forced labor, like having to work in mines or rock quarries, are still there. And England would often exile people abroad for labor punishments as well. So, pretty rough. But you also have the time for reformers. And probably the biggest guy that's out there for this is Cesare Beccaria. And he writes this book on crime and punishment and really kind of goes into a variety of different things that would be tremendously influential, not only on other enlightened thinkers, but actually on governments as well. Punishment should really only serve as deterrence, not an excuse to torture, or that shouldn't be like the goal. For instance, he says, such punishments ought to be chosen as will make the strongest and most lasting impression on the minds of others with the least torment to the body of the criminal. He is also big about being against the death penalty, and he says that, yes, the death penalty is shocking to see, but it doesn't really work. Longer stretches in prison would perhaps be more effective, and he also links it to this idea of barbarism, that executing is something that barbaric cultures do, that enlightened cultures that we have in Europe, that we shouldn't be doing these types of things. And by the end of the 18th century, this would inspire a movement of people to end torture and the death penalty. And what we will see is that governments and courts will start to lessen these. New types of jails will be built with individual cells for long-term jail sentences instead of the death penalty, and you will start to see some easing up on torture and things like that. So, making progress. And then the last thing I want to talk about are some advances in medicine, which is going to be kind of important at this time. Physicians and doctors are now kind of trained, and they are arriving at the top of social status that we do see today. And you do have changes in education, okay? Now, much is done in Latin-based education, and a lot of it is still work based on the work of Galen, who lived from the years 130 to 210. Now, not that Galen was like terribly long on everything. He actually was right on a variety of things, but that's still, pretty limited if you're going to focus on things from, the 100s to early 200s. And we will start to change clinical experience and the idea that you actually have to go to colleges to be trained to be a physician. The University of Leiden and then the University of Vienna, which you'd see pictures Leiden on the top, Vienna on the bottom. And then you have to get a doctorate in medicine from a university and then actually get a license. And only those that held these could actually consult with patients and even get paid. And so we are going to get the beginnings of educating people as much as we can. Now, surgeons are a little bit different. It's interesting today that surgeons are a little higher end, but because there was so little surgery, they're not quite as high as physicians. So physicians, guys, can give like drugs and medicines, and their job is to diagnose things, where surgeons, quote unquote, just did operations. Bleeding is still kind of a common thing, and interestingly enough, a lot of these guys are still barbers, and early on in the Enlightenment period, this is still pretty crude. There's no real painkillers, lots of issues with infections because the antiseptic methods that we have today are still not even understood. But we do get some changes. Surgeons actually begin to separate from barbers, interestingly enough, in the 1740s, and form their own guilds, like the ones that you see over there, the Royal College of Surgeons. They learn by studying and dissecting corpses, and federal governments actually start to allow that, and it becomes less of a spiritual thing that we need these people to learn. And they also begin to study medicine like doctors, and they do consultations and things like that. And then you also get the beginning of licensing of surgeons, particularly in England. And so we are making some pretty good changes here. Now, then you also have apothecaries or pharmacists. Unfortunately, the poor cannot go to doctors, okay? They can't afford it. And so, which isn't too different from today. So you have the creation of like pharmacists, which were then known as apothecaries, who their job was to provide herbs and potions that doctors prescribe, and they also had the ability to diagnose illnesses and prescribe medicines on their own. Um, and this was pretty big, okay? And these guys have to be more responsible. They could be penalized because obviously they know how to create these things, but they also could create, poison or deadly dosages of things, and so they would be highly regulated. And if they gave incorrect things, they could also, people could get executed as a result of that. Okay, but we do see some changes there that more and more people are getting involved. Hospitals are still kind of scary. They are not so good. People with serious illnesses aren't really quarantined. You often had dead people all over the place, high chances of infection. And that's what, like, to give you a great example, like, people who were going to have, obviously today, if you're going to give birth to a child, you go to the hospital. So back then, because the hospitals were so dangerous, you wouldn't do that. You would have a midwife. And midwives would, their job is to help consult during pregnancy and then help give birth, in the birth, not give birth, but help in the birthing process for women. And even though they're going to slowly but surely start to get replaced by doctors, they're still of vital importance and still actually exist today. But we're seeing some interesting changes in the societal things. We're seeing interesting changes in day-to-day stuff. And, we're going to continue to kind of monitor this stuff as we go throughout this time period, okay? All right, so we only got one more video to go here, and I will see you guys soon.